You are not exhausted because life is hard. You are exhausted because you are pretending to agree, pretending to care, pretending to be certain, pretending to be fine. And every day you pretend, something inside you pays. Not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily. According to Carl Jung, the greatest danger is not failure. It is self-betrayal. And most people do not realize they are betraying themselves because it feels normal. You learned early that being yourself was risky. Maybe your intensity was too much. Your sensitivity was dramatic. Your anger was disrespectful. Your ambition was selfish. So you adjusted. You softened your voice. You filtered your thoughts. You swallowed your instincts. And the world rewarded you. You became likable, reliable, acceptable. But something else happened. You became divided. Jung believed that when the persona, the mask you wear for society, becomes stronger than the self, a fracture begins. Not externally, internally. You start living from what is expected instead of what is true. And at first, it feels efficient. Life runs smoother. Conflict decreases. Approval increases. But beneath that surface, something tightens. A quiet tension, a low-grade anxiety, with no obvious source. Because the psyche knows when it is being ignored, and it keeps score. Living inauthentically is not a moral failure. It is an existential one. You slowly become a stranger to yourself. You wake up inside a life that works, but doesn't feel like yours. Your achievements feel hollow. Your relationships feel slightly off. Your laughter feels rehearsed, and you cannot explain why. So you assume something is wrong with you. You try to optimize, to improve, to fix, to upgrade your mindset. But the problem is deeper. You are living in contradiction to your inner nature. Jung called this a loss of soul, not mystical, psychological. The soul, in Jungian terms, is your inner orientation, your symbolic core, your natural direction. When you move against it long enough, energy drains, vitality fades, meaning evaporates. This is the existential cost. You don't collapse overnight. You thin out. You become efficient, but empty, functional, but fatigued, connected, but unseen. And the worst part? You may look successful, which makes the emptiness harder to admit. Because who complains when everything looks fine? So you silence the discomfort. You tell yourself, this is adulthood. This is responsibility. This is just how life is. But Jung would disagree. He believed neurosis often begins when we refuse our authentic development, when we choose adaptation over individuation. Adaptation keeps you safe. Individuation makes you real. And safety is often chosen over reality because reality requires risk. To live authentically means you will disappoint someone. It means you will be misunderstood. It means parts of your current life may no longer fit. So instead, you compromise, just slightly, just enough, until one day, you cannot locate where you end. An expectation begins. This is not dramatic. It is gradual, a slow erosion. You stop asking what you want. You start asking what is reasonable. You stop asking what feels true. You start asking what will cause the least friction. And friction avoidance becomes your compass. But a compass built on avoidance never leads to meaning. It leads to comfort. And comfort is not the same as alignment. Jung warned that the unlived life does not disappear. It accumulates as resentment, as envy, as quiet bitterness toward those who dare to be what you are not allowing yourself to be. That bitterness is information. It points toward the parts of you abandoned. Living inauthentically splits your energy. Part of you performs. Part of you protests. The performance exhausts you. The protest haunts you. You may distract yourself with productivity, with relationships, with constant stimulation. But in silence, the truth waits. The existential cost is not immediate punishment. It is gradual disconnection from instinct, from desire, from spontaneity, from depth. And when that disconnection persists, anxiety often appears, not because you are broken, but because your inner life is underrepresented. Depression may follow, not as weakness, but as a withdrawal of energy from a life that does not reflect you. Jung saw this repeatedly. People who were successful, but internally fragmented, they had everything except themselves. And the longer this continues, the higher the cost, because the psyche will eventually demand correction through crisis, through collapse, through a confrontation you can no longer postpone. And that confrontation always asks the same question: where did you abandon yourself? This is where the real work begins, not in self-improvement, but in self-return. And self-return is not comfortable, because you must first admit that you have been living in contradiction. That realization alone can destabilize you, but it is also the first honest moment in a long time. And honesty is where vitality returns, slowly, quietly, but undeniably. The existential cost of living inauthentically is your aliveness. And if you feel tired, in a way sleep does not fix, if you feel restless, in a life that looks stable, if you feel unseen, even when surrounded, then the cost is already being paid. The only question now is, how much longer are you willing to ignore it? At first, living inauthentically feels manageable. You tell yourself, it's temporary. You'll adjust later, speak later, change later. But the psyche does not operate on your social timeline. It operates on truth. And when truth is ignored, pressure builds. According to Carl Jung, what is repressed does not disappear. It returns, not politely, not symbolically at first, but somatically, through the body. Tight shoulders, shallow breathing, chronic fatigue, restlessness without cause. Your nervous system begins carrying the weight of the split, because living inauthentically requires constant monitoring. You must track what you say, how you appear, who you are with, what version of you is acceptable. That vigilance drains energy. You are not tired from effort. You are tired from performance. And performance cannot relax. Even in private, you remain slightly guarded, because you've practiced being someone else for so long that silence feels unfamiliar. This is where anxiety often intensifies, not as random malfunction, but as misalignment. Your outer life moves in one direction, your inner life leans in another, and the tension between them creates friction. Jung understood this as psychic imbalance. When the ego over-identifies with the persona, the socially approved identity, the deeper self withdraws. It does not compete. It waits. But waiting is not passive. The unconscious compensates. Dreams become vivid. Irritability increases. You overreact to small things. Why? Because small triggers touch the larger split. Someone criticizes you, and the reaction feels disproportionate. Someone ignores you, and it feels like rejection of your entire existence. That intensity reveals how fragile the constructed identity has become. When you live authentically, criticism stings. When you live inauthentically, criticism threatens survival, because the mask is all you have. This is the existential danger. If your identity is built on adaptation, then any disruption feels annihilating. So you double down. You refine the mask, become more agreeable, more strategic, more polished. Externally, you improve. Internally, you thin out. And then something shifts. Not gradually, abruptly. A loss of motivation, a sudden burnout, a collapse in meaning. Things you once cared about feel distant. Goals feel hollow. You cannot explain it, but you cannot push through it either. This is not laziness. It is resistance from the deeper psyche. Jung observed that when the self is neglected long enough, it withdraws libido, psychic energy. You lose drive because the direction is wrong. Energy follows authenticity. When you betray yourself, energy recedes. And without energy, even simple tasks feel heavy. This is where many people panic. They assume something is broken. They look for productivity hacks, mindset shifts, external fixes. But the crisis is existential. It is not about efficiency. It is about alignment. The longer the misalignment persists, the more severe the correction becomes. You may feel trapped inside a life you chose, a career that pays well, but drains you, relationships that look stable, but feel empty, friendships maintained, out of history, not resonance. This entrapment is not always external. Often, the cage is internal. You are loyal to an outdated version of yourself. You are protecting a structure that no longer fits, and the psyche knows it. So symptoms escalate, resentment surfaces. You become impatient with things you once tolerated. You envy those who take risks. You feel sudden urges to escape everything. This is not impulsivity. It is the repressed life, demanding space. But here lies the danger. If you have lived inauthentically for too long, when the correction comes, it may not be gentle, because what is suppressed does not disappear quietly. It erupts. You might quit abruptly, end relationships dramatically, burn bridges impulsively, not because authenticity is chaotic, but because repression built pressure, and pressure, when released suddenly, explodes. This is why gradual honesty is wiser than delayed truth. Small corrections prevent catastrophic ones. Jung believed individuation is not optional. It is a psychological necessity. You can postpone it. You can resist it. But eventually, life will confront you with yourself through crisis, through disillusionment, through a breakdown of what once felt stable. And in that confrontation, you are faced with a choice. Continue performing and numb the consequences, or dismantle the structure and endure the uncertainty. Both are painful, but only one leads to integration. The existential cost of living inauthentically is cumulative. It compounds over years. Lost vitality, muted creativity, shallow relationships, unexplained sadness, and perhaps the most subtle cost. You stop trusting your own instincts. You second-guess your desires. You hesitate before speaking truth because you've trained yourself to prioritize harmony over honesty. And once instinct weakens, direction fades. You drift. Drifting feels safe because it avoids confrontation. But drifting erodes meaning. Meaning requires intention. Intention requires alignment. Alignment requires courage. This is where Section 3 will take us. Because once you recognize the cost, the next question is unavoidable. What must be confronted to live differently? And that confrontation is not external. It is shadow. Once you realize you've been living inauthentically, a dangerous thought appears. If I stop pretending, who will I be? That fear is real because the mask has structure. It gives you predictability. It gives others stability. It gives you a role. Without it, there is uncertainty, and the ego hates uncertainty. According to Carl Jung, the ego prefers a stable falsehood over a destabilizing truth because truth reorganizes everything. Living inauthentically is not just about people-pleasing. It is about disowning parts of yourself that were inconvenient. Your anger, your ambition, your sexuality, your spiritual hunger, your need for solitude, your intensity. You didn't erase them. You buried them. And what is buried becomes shadow. The shadow is not evil. It is unlived life. It is everything you could not express without risking rejection. But here is the cost. The shadow does not stay passive. It leaks in sarcasm, in passive aggression, in sudden outbursts, in envy toward those who embody what you suppress. You say you dislike arrogance, but secretly wish you could be bold. You say you value peace, but fantasize about confrontation. You say you're content, but feel restless around risk takers. These contradictions are not hypocrisy. They are fragmentation, and fragmentation drains power because part of you is always fighting another part. Authenticity requires integration, not expression of everything. Integration. This means you do not act out your anger. You acknowledge it. You do not indulge every impulse. You understand its message. Jung believed that becoming whole does not mean becoming pure. It means becoming conscious. When you stop pretending, you begin to see your contradictions clearly. You are kind, but capable of cruelty. You are loving, but capable of withdrawal. You seek connection, but also sabotage intimacy. This awareness can be humiliating because it removes innocence. You can no longer see yourself as entirely good. But this loss of innocence is growth. The existential cost of living inauthentically is that you never meet your shadow. And when you never meet your shadow, you are ruled by it. Unconsciously, you project it onto partners, onto society, onto toxic people. Everything you deny in yourself appears threatening in others. But when you confront your shadow, something shifts. You stop being shocked by yourself. You recognize your capacity, and responsibility increases. You cannot blame triggers. You cannot blame energy. You own your reactions. That ownership is power, but it is heavy, because once you see your patterns, you cannot unsee them. You notice when you shrink, when you exaggerate, when you manipulate subtly to maintain approval, and instead of justifying it, you sit with it. This sitting is uncomfortable. Silence without distraction reveals the split, the part that wants truth, the part that wants comfort, the part that wants growth, the part that wants safety. Authenticity is choosing growth while respecting fear, not eliminating fear, respecting it. You will feel anxiety when you stop pretending because you are stepping outside the persona's protection. You may lose validation. You may disrupt dynamics. People accustomed to your compliance may resist your change. This is inevitable. Living authentically reorganizes relationships. Some will deepen, some will dissolve, and that dissolution is part of the existential cost. You cannot maintain connections that depend on your suppression. Eventually, you must choose belonging through performance or alignment through truth. Belonging feels warm. Alignment feels solid. Warmth without solidity leads to collapse. Solidity without warmth leads to isolation. The integrated self seeks both, but integration requires time. It requires experimentation. You will overcorrect at first. You may become blunt after years of silence. You may withdraw after years of overexposure. This is recalibration, not failure. Jung emphasized that individuation is not a linear upgrade. It is a spiral. You revisit old patterns with new awareness, and each time, the split narrows. Living inauthentically means you avoid this spiral. You remain static, predictable, safe, but stagnant. The existential cost is stagnation of the soul, and stagnation eventually becomes despair. Not dramatic despair, quiet despair, the kind that whispers, "Is this all?" That question is not a complaint. It is a summons. It signals that your inner life wants expansion, but expansion requires shedding. Shedding roles, shedding narratives, shedding identities that once protected you. This shedding feels like loss, because it is loss. You lose who you thought you were, and in that loss, there is emptiness. But emptiness is not death. It is space. Space for something real, something unforced, something aligned. And here is the turning point. When you begin living authentically, energy returns, not because life is easier, but because friction decreases. You are no longer fighting yourself. Decisions become clearer. No becomes cleaner. Yes becomes intentional. Your body relaxes slightly, not completely, but noticeably. This is how you know you are moving toward integration. The existential cost of inauthenticity is fragmentation. The reward of authenticity is coherence, and coherence is power, not loud power, stable power, the kind that does not need constant reassurance. But we are not finished, because once you integrate shadow and reclaim authenticity, another question emerges. How do you live this without becoming rigid, isolated, or self-righteous? Living authentically is not rebellion. It is alignment. And alignment is quiet. After the confrontation, after the shadow, after the destabilization, there is a subtle shift. You stop trying to impress. You stop trying to be understood by everyone. You stop negotiating your core for temporary comfort. According to Carl Jung, individuation is not about becoming special. It is about becoming whole. And wholeness does not shout. It stabilizes. When you live inauthentically, your life is organized around reaction. Who approves? Who disapproves? What will this cost socially? How will this be perceived? When you live authentically, your life reorganizes around orientation. Does this align? Does this expand me? Does this respect my nature? Does this require self-betrayal? The questions change. And because the questions change, the structure changes. You may earn less validation, but you gain internal solidity. That solidity feels unfamiliar at first, because you are no longer scanning the room for cues about who to be. You are referencing inward. That inward reference is the self. Jung described the self as the organizing center of the psyche. When the ego aligns with it, conflict decreases, not because life is easier, but because you are not divided. Division is exhausting. Wholeness conserves energy. This is the hidden reward. The existential cost of inauthenticity is fragmentation. The existential reward of authenticity is coherence. And coherence compounds. Your decisions become simpler, not easier. Simpler. You say no without over-explaining. You say yes without hidden resentment. You leave situations that require performance. You remain in situations that respect truth. This does not mean isolation. It means discernment. You begin attracting people who resonate with your reality, not your mask. These connections feel different, less dramatic, less performative, more grounded. They do not require constant adjustment because they are built on visibility. Visibility is risky, but it is alive. And aliveness is what you were missing. The exhaustion you felt before was not from effort. It was from suppression. Suppression requires force. Alignment requires courage. Courage costs something up front. Suppression costs everything slowly. When you choose authenticity, you may lose certain comforts. Predictability, universal approval, a neat narrative, but you gain depth. You gain respect for yourself. You gain the ability to sit alone without feeling fraudulent. And that is rare. Most people fear solitude because solitude removes distraction. And without distraction, they meet the split. You are no longer split, not perfectly integrated, but consciously aligned. You still feel fear. You still feel doubt. But they are signals, not dictators. This is maturity. Jung believed that the second half of life requires inward turning, not regression, integration. If you ignore that call, life becomes mechanical, repetitive, flat. If you answer that call, life becomes symbolic, meaningful. Even suffering shifts. When you live inauthentically, suffering feels pointless. When you live authentically, suffering feels developmental because it is connected to something real. The existential cost of ignoring your nature is a life that feels accidental. The existential reward of honoring your nature is a life that feels authored. You become responsible, not for everything, but for your direction. And responsibility creates dignity. Dignity is not confidence. It is integrity. It is knowing that even when you fail, you are failing honestly, not performing success. That difference changes everything. You sleep differently. You breathe differently. You relate differently. There is less inner negotiation, less silent resentment, less self-contempt, because self-contempt comes from betrayal, and betrayal ends when alignment begins. This does not make you superior. It makes you grounded. You no longer need to prove depth. You embody it. And ironically, the more authentic you become, the less you need others to validate it. That is the paradox. Approval becomes optional. Integrity becomes essential. The existential cost of living inauthentically is losing yourself gradually. The existential responsibility of living authentically is facing yourself continually. And facing yourself never ends. It deepens. You will still confront shadow. You will still outgrow identities. You will still experience disorientation. But now, you trust the process because you trust your orientation. That trust is psychological freedom, not freedom from fear, freedom from fragmentation. And fragmentation is the real prison. So if you feel restless, if you feel drained in ways rest cannot fix, if you feel like you are living adjacent to your own life, do not ask, how do I become more acceptable? Ask instead, where am I betraying myself? That question is the beginning of integration. And integration is the end of slow existential erosion. You do not need to become louder. You do not need to become extreme. You need to become honest. Quietly, consistently, courageously. That is the path. Not glamorous, not fast, but real. And real is what restores the soul. If this stirred something in you, don't scroll away from it. Sit with it, because discomfort is often the first sign that the self is trying to speak. Carl Jung once warned that the greatest burden a child must bear is the unlived life of the parent. But the greatest burden an adult must bear is their own unlived life. So here is the real question. Will you continue performing a version of yourself that keeps everyone comfortable? Or will you begin the difficult work of becoming whole? If this resonated, subscribe, not for motivation, for integration. This channel is not about self-improvement trends. It is about individuation. It is about shadow work. It is about reclaiming the parts of you that were exiled for survival. Comment below. Where are you still performing? And if you're ready to stop living divided, stay with this series. Because authenticity is not aesthetic. It is psychological responsibility. And very few are willing to pay that price. If you are, welcome to the work.